To have you here. We've got a really nice lineup of speakers starting today and then straight through the semester. For those of you that are regulars, do please notice that, or note that for 4 sessions this semester, we're pairing up with the AOS Colloquium, which is on Monday. So 4 times throughout the semester there will not be a CPEP. Instead we'll be co-hosting that with AOS on Mondays. Do you know the time off the top here?
Ooh, I don't know. Did I do? Does anyone know?
I think it's 3:30.
3:30?
Okay, yeah.
All right. Well, we'll
We'll
make sure
send
that
an
gets...
email.
And yeah, Alessandra does well to send out the weekly emails. We'll send out an email that week also just reminding everybody about that. So if you don't come here, if you do come here, there won't be cookies, coffee, or a speaker. So you'll be out of luck on those Tuesdays. But for at least next week, we are here also,
Yes.
right?
Yep.
Okay, so you can plan on that. I'm very happy to introduce our speaker today, Evan, who comes to us from within our great system of Wisconsin. He's at University of Wisconsin-Platteville, and is going to be speaking to us about some recent work that he's been doing, and so very happy to have him here. As some of you heard me mention, he's also generous enough in coming back and doing the Weston Roundtable seminar this week also. So that's at 4:15 over in the Mechanical Engineering Building. On Thursday, if you'd like to attend that one. So with that, Evan, I am going to turn it over to you. And if you'd like to introduce yourself any more, something Jack might have said. Maybe it would have been whimsical or not. I'm not sure. But I'll turn it over. To you. And thank you very much for being here. Really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for the introduction, and thanks all for being here. Really a pleasure on a beautiful day to come and talk about some of the work that I've been doing with students and colleagues at the University of Wisconsin-Platteville. Very, very exciting. Right now I'm professor and chair in the Department of Environmental Sciences and Society. We're a small program, but full of, I think, really passionate and engaged students. And we try and rope a lot of research in, and so I'm actually getting ahead of myself. So let's go ahead and dive in. So today I'm going to talk to you about some tree ring research that we've been doing through the region. When I started working with trees as an undergraduate student, one of the things that really impressed on me was how it expands my understanding and just my perception of time. And I think that that's really important because if we're talking about that, we're talking about things that are bigger than ourselves. We're talking about perspectives that if you just take the little snippet that you have seen in your life, then you're missing a lot of the story. And so I grew up in Malacca, Minnesota, right here, town of 2000. My folks lived about 15 miles outside of that town of 2000. This is my neighborhood. It's flat clay plan. Right here is a little meadow that when I was growing up, we would burn the meadow. And that was to keep it a meadow instead of letting it go to forest and for all these other interesting reasons. And if you want to talk about fire, that's what I'm going to be focusing on Thursday. So come on over, we can talk about fire a lot. But in my mind, I grew up in the woods, and that's what this place always was. If we go back to the aerial photograph from the 1940s, it's a really different landscape. And if you talk to some of the old timers down in Bach, Minnesota, town of 79, they will talk about how fires used to burn all the way across here, and that this esker right here was the best place to pick blueberries in the whole area. And I found that tree, and it's a fire-scarred red pine. And so those stories are still written on the landscape. And that is the space that we're in. And so in a time of really rapid and dramatic change, it's important to understand the trajectory and where we're coming from. So Plattville, Wisconsin, down here in the Driftless Area. It's an adorable little school, very pastoral. We are undergraduate only. It's about 400 acres on the main campus, so a lot of green space, a trout stream that flows through. The Big M is our big landmark. And in most cases now, as we're starting public events and things like that, we'll go through a land acknowledgement. And it's interesting because really, if you look at the boundaries of lands that were included in treaties between indigenous nations and the U.S. government, like it's all tribal land. In Wisconsin, we talk a lot about the Ho-Chunk. The land that UW-Platteville is on was actually ceded by the Potawatomi in a treaty in 1829. And then if you zoom in even further to the cultural complexity of that space, this is a wonderful resource. You can actually see that in addition to the Potawatomi, the Ochedisakoween, the Ho-Chunk, the Sauk and Fox in Miami, and the Kickapoo, all have ancestral connections to this landscape. And that's really important. Most of my students are somehow related to farming families. And so the conversation is that the richness of the soils of the Driftless that were so beautifully an expression of that prairie landscape working in these fresh, lust-based soils, that fertility, in fact, is also a legacy of the people who were living there who were using fire to tend that landscape. And that they literally inherited that richness, willingly or not. And so then that quickly puts on the questions like, when you are not here anymore, what are the legacies that you leave for those who come next? And I feel like that's all kind of wrapped up in here, especially when we start talking about tree rings. So a little bit more, Department of Environmental Sciences and Society. Again, small department, young, great faculty, a lot of fun. We do a lot of field work with our students. We emphasis on the conservation side, get out and translate some of the things we talk about in class to stewardship. This is up in woods. Hopefully there'll be a prescribed burn there this fall. We have old growth sugar maple on the Big M on the north slope. That's university property. So we go out and we tap maple trees as part of class to talk about the culture of it, the history, but also the chemistry and the ecology. You know, boil it down over open fire. It's a great learning experience. We talk a lot about stewardship. This is an overgrown former pasture in Oak Savannah on campus that got hit by a tornado. And so we'll take our chainsaw safety training courses out there, and the students then start to open up and put in the work. And we pair each of these work days with a chapter from Braiding Sweetgrass and kind of talk about the relationships that are being built here into this really beautiful space. It's one of my favorite spots on campus now. We burned it for the first time in probably 150 years last spring. So really fun. Fire is important. I talk about it almost all the time, so it has to come in here even though we're talking about climate and just the importance of fire on this landscape. Because from these perspectives that the trees are offering, you also see that shift in the processes that play on the land. And we're going to touch on that a couple ways. There's no way you can talk about trees, especially in the Driftless area, without acknowledging fire. It's fun to burn on campus too, because like this one went into the evening and all the students were like looking out their dorm windows, like hooting and hollering. You know, it was, and to talk about like how do you live with fire, because you have to, and the infrastructure and the power lines and the highways and all of this. So it's a great teaching and learning that. We emphasize research. What I'm going to share with you is a range of projects that have been done by undergraduate students over the last many years. I started in Plattville in 2009. So we've been doing this for a while, a lot of small research seminars. We really love field work. A lot of students learn really well when it's hands-on, out and doing, in all conditions, all over the state. This is up on Menominee Reservation. Here's a beautiful oak. If any of you have been to Pleasant Valley Conservancy, you maybe have walked by this oak. Cedars over in Iowa. A lot of tree ring research, a lot of kind of crossing disciplinary boundaries to help understand the story of the land.
Where's Pleasant Valley Conservancy?
Not far from Cross Plains.
Okay. Oh,
Beautiful.
close by.
It's on the Ice Age Trail. Check it out. We have a great lab facility. Students get to do kind of the hands-on work in the field and then translate that into research and posters and conferences. Does anybody know who this is? This is just a delightful moment. His name's Kerry Mock. He's a very accomplished climatologist. And this is Tia Fetterman, first generation farm kid who did some cool tree ring work. And this is at a national conference, and Kerry came by like 3 times because he kept wanting to talk to her. And I stopped. I was like, Tia, do you know what that was? She's like, no, I have no idea. And I like pulled out his book. She's like, really? So it's just delightful. Perspective. I would assume that several of you probably actively contributed to this, and many of you are familiar with Wiki. What a great resource to have at the level of the state, you know, looking at these changes in temperature and precipitation, and thinking about how important this foundational understanding is for then kind of seeing how is our climate changing, and especially where is it going to change from here. And I think one of the key kind of setups for the work that my students and I are doing is if you look at the data on which those figures that I just showed you are from, an amazingly spatially coherent network of weather stations. It's awesome, it spans the state. However, since 1950, right? And we all know that climate operates on really important timescales beyond that. And so if you look at the predictions and you think about all the immense computational power and models that went into predicting where we're going, it really matters what those are calibrated on and what that information is based on. With tree rings, it's a great teaching topic. It's super tangible. We host K-12 school kids and scout groups and all this in the lab. Because you can hand a sample and they're like, first thing is like, how old is it? You can count the rings. And then it's an easy step to think about wide and narrow rings. And so these have been used all over North America, all around the world to reconstruct climate. One of the really important data sets that was developed a long time ago is the North American Drought Atlas. It's a gridded reconstruction of PDSI, Palmer's Drought Severity Index. And at each one of these grid points, it was a point-by-point regression where you were pulling in tree rings from kind of a geographic area that related to climate at that location. And then you would interpolate kind of across the whole of the dotted grid. When I first started in Plattville, this was kind of like the cutting edge of the science. There are newer versions, but what was really interesting is if you go from here to the actual data behind that gridded reconstruction, you can see right here, there's a big old gap. And for those of you who are familiar with the Driftless Area, it is both beautiful and full of cheese and cows, but also very distinct, right? Unique bedrock for the region, unique soils. And so not having tree ring data from the Driftless and yet talking about soil moisture availability in the Driftless, that's an issue, I think. And I was thinking about this in the context of the Driftless Area. This is from on top of the Big M. That's an Amish farm down there. And I was biking out there and I was looking at these oak trees and I'm like, man, those are so beautiful, these open grown oaks, right? Right, and then the cows. Really good cheese. And then thinking about the original vegetation maps from Finley and how all through southwest Wisconsin, it's prairie and oak savanna. And then realizing that some of these oak trees then are very likely those trees that were included in the GLO survey. Some of these are kind of pre-Euro-American arrival to these places. I was like, all right, well, let's do a project and call it the Driftless Oaks because I love the word driftless. Funding from the Water Resources Institute. Launched this. We had a couple of years kind of going all over. We scoured all the public lands in southwest Wisconsin, and there's not a lot of public land actually. It's mostly private. But we found some really great trees, some old oak trees. And it was kind of lonely because we were just like, out looking. And one of the undergraduates who was working on it helped write a short piece to the Wisconsin Natural Resources magazine. And it was basically about the project, and it ended by saying like, hey, do you have old oaks that you'd like us to meet? We had 260 people reach out. I got oak trees. It was amazing. And then the best part is like, not only do they have oak trees, they love oak trees, but then it's like, oh, they were in it. They're like, what you doing there? Leaning over, and then if you got the right groups, then you're like, well, now you can core an oak tree, and this is now citizen science and engagement, and it saves our arms and backs, because coring oak trees is really hard. And it was just this awesome community outreach project, and one of my dreams when I moved to the Driftless was to finally get to walk up all of those little hollows that you see, and we finally got to do it. It was so cool. It was really, really beautiful. Dale Schultz had us out, former state legislator. Met some fascinating trees. This is about a 300-year-old tree that supposedly was a culturally modified tree. And just like the deep affection for the land and these trees that people shared. It was really awesome. I also will call out Sarah, single mom, non-traditional student. She was the one who helped write the article, and she totally took lead on this. Worked as a post-baccalaureate fellow for a year and just did a ton of the work to coordinate all of this, to get the trips, to help organize student efforts. It was really awesome. We also got to work with buildings. This is an 1835 house, or is it? It actually, based on the timbers, was built in 1849, but the National Historic Register has not been updated. You know, old barns, you can find timbers in the structure. Those are all oaks. Those can be looped in, an old schoolhouse in Shake Rig Alley, Mineral Point. And so it's just really fun because sometimes the cabins are built or not, but really just we're surrounded by this information. These legacies last in so many different ways. So we sampled at 46 different sites. Importantly, has anybody ever cored a tree? Okay. So increment bores. We broke 17 with first-time undergraduates cranking on these gigantic oak trees. It was a doozy, but just a great project. And so the data that emerged, we're talking about the relationships between people and land that's layered into the stories. So this is the extent of all the sites. All of these are the cabins. So you can clearly see like 1850s when people started cutting down trees and building cabins, right?
Are those the initials of the owners?
Those are site names. So yeah, Bowling Horse Barn, Shake Rig Alley,
Okay.
Mineral Point Brewery. We got a free beer off of that one. That was great.
Yeah.
This is the age structure of all the trees we cored. And you see this huge bump. A lot of trees are establishing in the mid to late 1800s. And it was funny because we were looking at and thinking about it and kind of working in isolation because we were very much focused on climate at the time. And I was pulling a reading from the Sand County Almanac for a different class. And I pulled up April. There's a section called Bur Oak. And in it, Leopold writes, in the 1840s, a new animal, the settler, intervened in the prairie battle. He didn't mean to, he just plowed enough fields to deprive the prairie of its immemorial ally, fire. Seedling oaks forthwith romped over the grasslands in legions. And so he talks about how all the trees around here germinated in the 1850s, or at least sprouted into trees in the 1850s. And so we saw that in the data set, which was really interesting, because that wasn't the question we were looking for. It also meant that we would often get calls like, hey, I got this big oak tree, can you come core it? And we would see it, and we started just calling them Leopold oaks, because they're all 150 years old. They don't do anything to contribute to the data, but we drove all the way out there, and now like, and then the borer would get stuck, and you'd spend an hour and a half getting one tree cord. It was a mess, but it was super fun. Lots of tree ring samples, lots of students. These are kind of the different chronologies. Just you can see ups and downs throughout, and you standardize them all, and you weave them into a mean chronology for the sites for all 46 locations. And then here's the final chronology. We got back into the 1600s, which for oaks is pretty great. Subsample signal strengths, we have a robust 300-year chronology, is what this figure is basically telling you. You see ups and downs. This is the calibration against Climate Division 7, Palmer Drought Severity Index. The fact that the dotted line, which is the instrumental, and the red line, the reconstruction, match really well, tells you it's a robust reconstruction. We can now estimate past drought from the growth rings of these oak trees. This is the spatial signature of the reconstruction. So this hot spot right here basically covers the driftless. So the driftless oaks, nailed it. We have a driftless-based drought reconstruction. And it goes back about 300 years. When I first started this, the big floods had been in 2008. We now have more big floods we can talk about. But so it's interesting to see how many years show wetter conditions than some of these really wet years. And then the 2012 drought was the big year. A lot of pines died at Devil's Lake. And you can see there's a number of years that are more extreme drought. So you're starting to contextualize what we see. The wets, the dries, and then what I'm really interested too is these periods, like 8 to 10 years of consistent drought, because we don't see that very often in this region. We don't stay dry for very long, which is pretty interesting. I feel like in this room I should be asking more questions, but I'll share the result and we can talk about this later. Things like volcanoes we know influence climate around the globe. A friend of mine does a lot of work with bristlecone pine. We were chatting about it. He's like, have you looked at the driftless oaks? Like, I don't know. So this is superposed epoch analysis comparing Palmer Drought Severity Index departures relative to 7 largest volcanic eruptions that were climatically effective over the instrumental period. And what's interesting is T is the year of the eruption. Anything that's above or below these horizontal lines is significant. And so there's nothing that really stands out the year of, but 2 years after, if you look at the light gray, that's instrumental, I should say dark gray, it is significantly positive departure in PDSI, so wetter than normal, cooler, and rainier, kind of combine into that PDSI. With only 7 samples, that's an okay result. It's a bootstrapped analysis. It handles that pretty well. But what's interesting is, if we go back 300 years and look at the 13 major eruptions over that time, it's the same result. And so, if people are familiar with kind of the generalized impacts of volcanic eruptions on Wisconsin climate, like I would love to talk more, like does this make sense? How are circulation patterns influenced that would actually shift storm tracks or cloudiness to make this a thing? Because how about, wouldn't that be cool if farmers in the region without irrigation could make at least a prediction based off of an eruption 2 years ago? Don't know if we'll ever get there.
Was that Pinatubo volcano?
No, that was, I don't remember, it was from 2016. The other thing we did was we looked at corn yield and soy yield over the southwestern part of Wisconsin, Grant County. The thin line is the interannual yields, and so you can see it's been going up and up and up for the full record of what we have. Improved technology, improved genetics, like all of these techniques that go into agriculture for both corn and soy. The smooth line was a spline I fit just to kind of standardize that down. And then down here, this was kind of fun. So this now shows you the index of corn, the index of soy, and the driftless oaks reconstruction. And so there's some noise here, there's some difference, but by the time you get to the last couple decades, they're almost identical. And so what this is really telling us is that our corn production in southwest Wisconsin has been so maximized to every variable that we can control, is that now we are literally looking at a system on the interannual basis that is driven more by climate than it ever has been. Which I think is pretty cool. Okay, so those are some of the things we got from the oaks. Beautiful hikes, but man, these things are tough. To core an oak is, whoa. Troopers, yes. Literally the last day of the project. We're over by Viroqua, Duckhead County Park, working up this ravine. We're coring some beautiful old bur oak trees. And at the top of the ravine, I saw this chunk of rock. And I noticed like, oh hey, there's a cedar tree up there. We should go check it out. And so I come up on it, and from the western United States, if you ever see a spiked top, you're like, that's an old tree, I like that one. So I walk out on this, it's like, well, that does look pretty old. And if you've cored a cedar tree, it's like butter, you just twirl it in.
Wow.
And I pulled out the core, and Sarah, of course, who has gone 420 oak trees into this project, sees me core this, pull out the core, and I do a field count real quick. There's 270 rings in it.
Wow.
And she's like, you have got to be kidding me. And thus is born the Driftless Cedars project. So we're just in the last phase of this. It's a grant in collaboration with some folks at University of Arkansas and Columbia, University of Tennessee in Memphis, and University of Missouri, where we've got our eye on developing a Great Plains gridded drought atlas from local trees. Again, to improve that North American drought atlas by getting local data. And so the idea of these cedar trees hanging out kind of on the driftless, which is the edge of the prairie, got really exciting. And for those of you who have driven around, like, you've seen these trees. Every little outcrop. Anybody hike Gibraltar Rock? It's a nice spot. Down along the Mississippi is like, there are the cedars. There are the cedars. There are the cedars. Leaf-off imagery is awesome. You see these all over the place. And starting to go and visit, like, these trees are amazing. And just like beautiful locations, right? And again, I was saying we actually tried to get permission to rappel down to some of these, but risk management was like chainsaws on ropes, on cliffs. I don't think so, but we'll get there. You know, and so this is all done with students. We partnered with folks at Luther College and some other UW La Crosse. get out onto the sites and core these trees, Alba Leopold Foundation, and a lot of what we're finding is old living trees, but the remnant wood is awesome, because one of the things the cedar doesn't do is decay. It's very rot resistant. And so, we're kind of working on cliff edges. This is Kaylee Lapham, she just graduated. This is the first tree she ever cored. It's at Devil's Lake. 510 rings, didn't hit the middle. In Wisconsin. This is James Reiser. He's been on the project since day one. His wife works at the Wood Products Lab here. He has background in treeing research and rock climbing. He's been phenomenal. He's been a huge contributor to this project. And when it's just too dangerous for the students, we're like, James! And he's like, okay. And so this is the Mississippi. Yeah, some just really beautiful trees. And James will be proud to say that he proposed going to Gibraltar Rock first, and it paid off big time. And just to appreciate the trees. They're absolutely beautiful. We did not cut any living trees. We cut stumps. Otherwise, we cored trees because they're too important. You also see the history of the land here. This tree is so gnarly, you know it grew up in entirely open conditions. And yet if you look at this, what's fascinating is this is the old one. Here's another red cedar, but it's straight and tall. That one's 150 years old, just like all the Leopold oaks. And then all the hardwoods that now shade these out. We literally have old growth forest in Wisconsin that's tucked beneath the canopy of this surging second growth. Just fascinating. There's a whole ecology story here, and I can't wait to go to the Society of Ecological Restoration and be like, whoa, we got to restore red cedar, because if you're in that sphere, you will know that that is one of the species that is hated above all else if you're in prairie restoration and things like that. And just the shape and the angles, but really hard to photograph because you're so tangled up in all that growth.
Wow.
But then you get to look at it close, and it's just beautiful. Textures and the colors. I'm sure there's an interesting study of kind of the lichens and the mosses and things that show up on different aged trees. And then when you cut them, how many of you used a Sharpie? I figured that was safe for scale in this room. You see those rings? Barely. So then you polish it up, and they're just beautiful. This one goes back to 1436. That's a decent sample. Color, it smells good. This is why nobody's done this work before. Did you think the trees were round? A cedar will prove you wrong. I will also make note. So here's a ring. It's nice. And, oh, it's gone. Oh, wait, there's another one that comes and goes. Not sure. What about this one? That's got to be good. No, it's gone. Oh my gosh. And I love, where's the one that actually starts and it crosses? I think it's in this perspective. There's a ring that starts on one and goes up and blends with the other. They're just, I mean, it's really difficult. And the thing that blows my mind is from a tree ring perspective, you would never guess that you could get a coherent signal, but it is absolutely robust. These are some of the most beautiful and some of the strongest chronologies I have ever helped develop. It's really exciting. And so when you work through the mess, if you can mark your rings, think about it. I know it's bigger than pollen, I get it, but from a tree ring perspective, like, wow. Anyway, it gets to be really exciting. So here's the Driftless Area. These are the chronologies we've now developed. Devil's Lake is great. Gibraltar Rock is just outside the Driftless, but we're going to count it. Color-coded into some chronologies that I'm going to share with you now. Appropriately named Cedar Ridge Road. This is one where you could literally high-five the old trees as you drive by. That was the cover slide. Heritage Valley goes back to the 1300s. 1350s for a tree ring chronology in Wisconsin. The longest previous chronology went back to 1680. So like 330 years. Mississippi collection just hits 1200. Palisades, has anybody been to Decorah? You can literally spit onto downtown from this site. And it hits the 1100s. Gibraltar Rock, 1128. And then of course Devil's Lake It is an exceptional landscape in all ways. 808. 808. These are amazing. It's one thing to build a chronology, and it's fun too, because you look at these, and there are some places where they're very similar. You'll see a few spikes. Oh man, everybody had a good year. But then there are other places where you're seeing some real difference in these chronologies, which from our perspective is really exciting, because there is this overall signal, but there's also important differences, especially at the low frequency. And so we're looking at now kind of heterogeneity in the data set that can be really helpful, and to visualize it here, the climate footprints of the different collections. As you can see, Gibraltar Rock outside of the Driftless area actually captures climate across the Great Lakes, which is really interesting. You get over to Palisades. This is in Iowa, how it's almost more of a western signal.
Is that because of the altitude?
I believe that it is differences in a little bit in soils. When you say altitude,
How high I mean, Gibraltar Rock's 350 feet above the
yeah,
landscape.
yeah, it's a great question. I will say no. I think that it's something else. I think that you're actually seeing geographic differences in climate here and the substrate. Devil's Lake has a slightly different signal than a site that's not up here, which we sampled right near Kurt Miney's house, Fox Bluff. So there's so many questions now where like, ooh, there's so many interesting. So this is kind of like recruiting grad students, because like this is beyond undergrads now. They can do the great work, the grunt work of building these chronologies. And I like to gloat sometimes, because working on this project, really beautiful, great sites, and I shared them with Ed Cook, who, if you know who Ed Cook is, he's seen some trees, he's done some work, right? And it's like, these collections are phenomenal. It's like, oh. And I love this, site sitting on landscape, undiscovered and unsampled until now, just shows how much there is yet to be discovered. It's like, that's awesome. That's really, really exciting. And remember, all done by undergraduate students. So, what can we do now? This is a depiction of county by county corn production. This is broadly called the Corn Belt, which I giggle whenever I say, because I think that's kind of a fun name. Dave and Ed and others, we have a manuscript in review where we are reconstructing precipitation over the Corn Belt, driven largely by the Devil's Lake chronology. This is the calibration. I apologize for the resolution, but the blue line is our reconstruction. The black line is the instrumental rainfall over this broad zone. It's amazing. The signal is phenomenal. So once it's published, there will be a brand new 800-year reconstruction of rainfall over the Corn Belt in the upper Midwest. The previous reconstruction went back 350 years. I mean, this is leaps and bounds. And so now all of a sudden you start talking about the potential to like calibrate what we're understanding. And part of the inspiration was thinking about kind of like in that medieval climate anomaly space, like what was weather doing over the primary kind of breadbasket of America. And this is now finally giving us local data where we can actually start to look at that and start to wonder and start to know. Generally, when you do a paleo reconstruction, especially in the tree ring community, what you like to do is be like, okay, so, you know, here's the instrumental record. We had some droughts for sure. Did you notice the 1300s? There's no way our agricultural systems can survive that. Zero. Especially when our aquifers are already drawn down so much. Anyway, so there's some real implications here, kind of thinking about this. There's other stories layered into the data set. So Eagle Valley Nature Preserve was one of the sites. It's on the Mississippi. It's owned by the Kohler family. We went here to look for old trees. So triangles are the cedars, the circles are the oaks. And it was kind of fun because like the oaks, you call this a wolf tree. Classic, like big old oak, open grown, surrounded by younger trees now. But this was early in our kind of working with cedar. And what we found is like some oldish living cedars, but a lot of stumps. And the stumps are the gold. Oh my gosh. And so this is also during the pandemic, so it's like socially distant field work. And then if anybody has ever tried to core an oak, that's one thing. You ever tried to core an oak in a mask? Oh, It's awful. But what was cool then is that then I got to recruit my favorite field crew, my family, and we went out and we sampled all these trees and we worked them up. The oaks, not a lot of super old ones, which was interesting in and of itself, because that's what everybody was super happy to show off. But the cedars were really interesting. All of these are what we would call like that post-settlement cohort. But check out all of these that all end here. Those are all the stumps. They were cut in the early 1800s, like 1810s, 1820s. And what's interesting is they're test mines all over this property. So those are trees that were cut during the logging, or the mining boom in southwest Wisconsin. Now this is the part where I'm like, oh, this is so cool, because here we are, we're talking about the history and the context. This is a map from 1829. All the stipples those are the active lead mines in southwest Wisconsin. We'll zoom in. So like here's Eagle Valley. There's nothing actually showing there, but you can see there's a lot of kind of westernized European history here on this landscape in 1829. Has anybody used the GLO survey records, like the original vegetation? What year were those surveys?
In southeastern or southwestern Wisconsin, 1830s, and northern Wisconsin, 1860s.
So like after this?
Yeah.
Makes you wonder if that's a good restoration benchmark, right? Think how modified that landscape already was. And you can see this now because you think about the ecological inertia. I would imagine some of you have seen images like this. So aerial photo from 1940, 61, 74, 86, and then 2019. And you can see like the canopy that was open is now closed and the forest is kind of creeping in on all of these old spaces. What's interesting is there has been active restoration of what are called goat prairies. These bluff exposed habitats, really important, lots of rare species that live there. There have been habitat restoration efforts at Eagle Valley since the early 80s. And you can see the goat prairies here, and I guess I'll jump ahead to the next slide and we'll show this. So this is the farmstead. You can see from 1940 to 2019, just dramatic changes, right? Continuous forest cover. If you go down onto the ridge, so this is kind of a CRP restored prairie kind of thing. These are the goat prairies, these open balds and rock outcrops, and you can see they just kind of disappear. Remember, this is after 20 to 30 years of active restoration to restore goat prairies, and you can see that climbing in. Two key pieces from this work as we go out to look for climate. This is LiDAR of Eagle Valley. Does anybody notice anything really interesting on this? Mounds. Man, you want to have fun, take a LiDAR trip down the Mississippi. So, does anybody know anything about the political reorganization of Cahokia in this room? About the general timing? About when?
1200.
1200? Did you notice when those cedar trees were starting to establish?
About that.
About then.
About then, huh?
Is that-
So, are we actually seeing literally the first trees to establish on really important cultural sites along the Mississippi? Then, think about this. All those cedars were open grown. The oaks were open grown. We now have closed canopy forest, potentially for the first time in 1,000 years on that site. And so it gives you a sense when we're talking about restoring, like what are you restoring to and how much inertia do you have going on this site? Another piece, so as part of that project, we did a reconstruction, not so much to reconstruct climate, but just to show how trees are tracking weather and such. And so instrumental records from Gutenberg, across the river, the brown is reconstruction based off of the oaks and the cedars. And specifically, this down here is showing you the difference between what was reconstructed versus the instrumental. And so where you see blue, that is the instrumental record getting wetter and wetter and wetter, but the tree rings not being able to track it. And so in conversation with Ed and Dave, Ed Cook is a magician with the process of what's called standardization, and I think that he's nailed this, but there's a lot of challenges in places where the trees are not able to track the rainfall anymore because it's so much wetter than they can actually use. And so I want to dub a term. We're going to call this the great wettening. And I think it's going to be a really interesting thing. And maybe we're wrong, but again, like this is one of these pieces that kind of comes out. It's like, wow, it is wetter now than it has been for hundreds of years, potentially. So we step back. I started in Plattville 2009. These are the chronologies that the students I've worked with have put together. Some are hemlock up north, red cedar, northern white cedar, spruce, oak, red pine, maple, tamarack, and white pine. So we've done work all over the place. And thinking about at this institution, here we are, Wisconsin idea. I heard the dean of the Nelson Institute expressing frustration that the Nelson Institute has all of a sudden gotten popular. They've been doing it at the Nelson Institute forever, you know. The idea of like us as universities serving the people and thinking, how do we do that with dendrochronology? We're now getting to the point where we can start thinking about some of the data needs. Groundwater, that's a big issue. We can't necessarily speak to the pollution of groundwater with tree rings, but that's a pretty good calibration of groundwater elevation in Grant County. Have we had time to work this one up? Nope. We can reconstruct groundwater elevations for hundreds of years. That is relevant for the Central Sands. If you look at lake level variability, this is an interesting one. This is one of the versions of the climate signal of the Devil's Lake Red Cedar. You can see that it has information across the Great Lakes. You look at the Lake Superior watershed and the Lake Michigan watershed and the Huron. They're pretty small relative to the size of the lakes. This is the first estimation of Lake Superior evaporation, which is one of the primary drivers of lake level change in Lake Superior. Haven't had time to work it up. We're doing this with undergraduates, people. Some patience, this is amazing, right? What about the Mississippi? That's important. This is the climate footprint of the Mississippi Valley Eastern Red Cedar chronology that we developed. This is what I was just looking at over the weekend. I was like, oh, I didn't even think about that. And you compare it to the geography of the upper Mississippi Basin. We'll go to Clintonville. It's been around for a while. This is actually a suburb of Clintonville, Lyonsville, 1868. So folks have been living there for a while. And they've been tracking Mississippi River discharge. And so that is estimated, well, that is the amount of water going through the Mississippi at Clintonville, Iowa for the last 160 years. That's a pretty good record for calibration. This is the Mississippi tree ring collection. With one chronology, we capture 21% of the variance of the Mississippi River in stream flow. The Mississippi tree ring collection goes back 800 years. Mm-hmm. So now all of a sudden, oh right, and it's fascinating too to look at some of these departures, like this right here. That's the 1993 flood when the Mississippi was going gangbusters. And trees do a really poor job of capturing the peaks because when it runs off, they don't get to record that water.
When did Army Corps of Engineers start really modeling Mississippi River?
I think it's the 50s.
When did they reverse the Chicago River?
Good question. That is more recent.
Isn't that 1930s? Wasn't it?
Is it 30s?
Progress administration? I'm not sure.
So this
Looks
is
like the early part of the record is much more correlated than the latter part.
so what's really interesting. I love that comment. It's not what you think, because and this is partly I think why nobody's looked at the Mississippi because it has had controls for so long.
Right.
What's really interesting is this is the Mississippi Valley. If you look at the Palisades collection from Decorah, it absolutely captures the first part very well. But it doesn't capture the late part as well. So now what we can do is bring in all of these different chronologies through principal components-based approach. We'll be able to kind of parse out the different areas of contribution. And then what's fascinating is to look at the 93 floods. This gets exactly to your point. So these were the most severe floods in red. And you'll notice that our collection rate up here, it wasn't as bad. And if you look at rainfall that contributed to that, it all fell in Iowa. And it came in from the west. Didn't fall over the Driftless. But we have a chronology over there. When I was looking at those wiggles and talking about how they're showing different patterns of variability, we now have the ability to kind of pull at different places in the watershed And if you take the stream flow measure at Clintonville, right here, and calibrate it with rainfall, you can see the areas that contribute most importantly to Mississippi stream flow at Clintonville. This is now our sampling guide. I got a call from a dude. It's like, I got some really old cedar trees, and he's right over here. So that's the next spot for the students, right? So this is really exciting. To have a 1,000-year reconstruction of Mississippi River stream flow, all of a sudden gets out to the scale that's starting to overlap with some of the work by folks in this room. And that to me is really exciting. And then again, to think about now, are we getting closer to a point, certainly for the southern part of the state, there's some gaps for chronologies up here, but I know some folks who are working in that area, to actually go on a county by county scale, to like really embrace the Wisconsin idea and start to produce like, here is, you know, what are the hydrology questions in the central sands? Groundwater certainly, right? What can we do for reconstruction there to help pour gasoline on the conversation between the potato growers and the trout fishermen, right? Lake level variability up here. Did any of you ever go to Pigeon Lake Research Station back when it was in the UW system? It's on a lake up in up here and hydrologically connected because it's all sand. They hayed the lake in the 1930s because it was all gone. Start thinking about kind of some of those questions about these long-term changes.
They did what to the lake?
They grew hay because the lake was gone.
Oh.
We can now start to kind of address some of these kind of locally important and strategic questions and bring this research kind of squarely to the people of Wisconsin, which I think is really, really exciting. And so, thanks for hanging out. To end with a Leopold quote, these are the things I ponder as the kettle sings and the good oak burns red coals on white ashes, because that weaves in all of my favorite things, because I also love firewood. And I will say thank you, and we have time for conversation.
All right, thank you very much. Really, really appreciate the insightful talk. We do have time for questions.
Sir?
Yeah, you raised the question of the influence of volcanoes on temperature locally. If I remember correctly, there was, in the 80s, record cold in this area. I think it was like -25 Fahrenheit or -80 to 100 with the wind chill. And that was alleged to have been caused as a result of the effects of Mount Pinatubo's eruptions. So
Yeah.
that's an example there.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, it hasn't really gotten that cold in this area since then. Of course, a lot of that's due to climate change as well.
Sure. Yeah, I think that's a really interesting piece to kind of give a little bit of credibility. And just thinking about how aerosols and dust veils kind of migrate around, like
Right.
it has to have an effect. So, yeah.
I'll follow up on that. So one of the big things that people are looking at is geoengineering
Yes.
and adding aerosols to the stratosphere.
What could possibly go wrong?
Yeah.
And I mean, if it's interesting that you're seeing this 2-year lag and you're attributing it to not stratospheric, dimming, but, because that's kind of, I mean, it's pretty well mixed in a year or so.
Yeah. I think that
But it does sound like you have something where you could look at regional impacts of major aerosol injections.
I think that there's a couple pieces that we're curious about that. Because like the fact that it shows up in the temperature and rainfall of the instrumental record, I think that's interesting, right? If you're talking about it from the perspective of a tree, like moisture availability is one thing, but photosynthesis is more efficient when you have diffusion of light. So it could actually be that some diffusion is also facilitating increased growth. So I think that result that I shared is like, it's super interesting to like pursue, but I am very curious what the actual mechanism of trees growing more trees
It's solar flux.
could be.
changes. So Matt Hitchman in the department has done a lot on looking at how Pinatubo spread from the tropics out into
Yeah.
the latitudes and the time scale of that.
Yeah,
Reach out to him.
yeah, that sounds great. Good. Question?
I was really struck by the red cedar records that are not in agreement. indicating a lot of localized variability, and yet you're scaling up to look at regional patterns. How would that localized variability impact people living on the landscape in those places? Would it be captured in your broader scale models or not?
I love that question. That's really interesting. So thinking about what drives a cedar tree to put a wide ring versus a narrow ring, what's really an important characteristic is a lot of these trees are on the very edges of bluffs, and so there's no soil. And so rainfall is important, but it goes away really fast, as opposed to the oak trees, which are in soil, and they'll be able to take advantage of long-term soil moisture. And so the cedar generally show a sharper climate signal, like there's more variability, and I think what we're seeing is that it's very much like, definitely rainfall, but I would love to take a look at daily data and be like, is it actually more important like the number of days it rained rather than like the amount of water that fell? Because I think for some of those trees you're going to find that. And then when you think about kind of the spatial variability in rainfall is so high relative to temperature that you could get a bunch of rainfall on Gibraltar Rock and not get Madison wet. It happens. Then you layer on like the influence of temperature, because there's actually a really strong correlation with temperature, and it's inverse. So hot summers mean a narrow ring in cedar trees, and that's most likely because when it's hot they have to use more water to maintain photosynthetic efficiency. So that's also an impact. So if you look at kind of drought, they do a good job of capturing that with contributions from both the rainfall and the temperature. To spin that out to like the scale of like human impacts, I think that the coherent signal might be related to that temperature piece. And the differences on a site by site might be, how the storm set up that year. When I think about the impacts on humans, and I think about, are you talking about modern agricultural systems that are kind of locked in place, or perhaps a more fluid society that's like, well, it's dry in Iowa, and so we're not getting a lot of regrowth, so the bison are over there, or the elk, or whatever, so you just move to it. And so you might see reason to be a little bit mobile over the long term. But I think that's a really cool question, just to kind of like think about what the variability tells us, and not just like the coherent signal.
Thank you.
Yeah.
When you find stumps, how do you know what year it was cut down?
Oh, great question. There's a whiteboard. Sorry. Okay, so if you core a tree, basically what you have is, here are the roots, and every year that tree, you can kind of think about it as kind of like putting a new cone of wood on. So every year it kind of adds a layer of wood. So that importantly, one of the things that we always have to talk about is if there's a branch, that branch doesn't ever grow up. It just gets bigger where it is, because the tree is adding layers, right? So you know that if a tree is alive, it's continuing to add these layers. So what year is this, if we core it today? 25. Okay. Question is, you got this stump. We don't know. And if you go and take a look at what these records kind of look like on the stump. It's a little blurry, apologize for that. It's a much higher resolution image that we use to scan and actually measure. But what I'd ask you to look at is, look at the width of these trees. And you really see like, man, that was a narrow ring. That was a narrow ring, and then it's wide again. And then we get a really narrow ring, we got some wide rings, and you start thinking about this almost like a barcode, because these are driven by rainfall. And rainfall is never the same 2 years in a row. And then if you have rainfall records for like 100 years, and you start looking at that combination of wide and narrow, that sets up what is literally like a fingerprint or a barcode in time. And so what you can do is, if you have an old tree, and you count back the rings, and then you look at kind of and then there's the bark. And then you cut the sample or the stump, and you start looking if you have an overlap, and if the trees are sensitive, and if they're from the same kind of climate area, on the same type of site. What you love to see is kind of those same patterns. This was the outer ring of that stump. And so it's really fun because the traditional approach that was established when dendrochronology kind of became a science, it's called skeleton plotting, where you literally, you look at a tree under the microscope and on a piece of graph paper, you draw, was it a narrow ring or a wide ring? And how wide and how narrow, right? Super subjective. And you do that with a thing like this. And it is so much fun because the students who often, the first time they're like, right, this will work. And then you start sliding those pieces of paper together and all of a sudden it's just like, click. And it's just awesome. And so by kind of matching up those patterns, you can do that. And then like with the cedars, like there are a lot of approaches statistically to confirm that you do actually have the date. And width is one thing, but like, see how some of the rings actually have different colors and different variations in like their appearance? Those can be just as important. Oaks, if they're flooded out in the spring, put on a white band. Volcanoes, my master's thesis work, in the Northern Rockies, there was a frost ring in 1602 because of Hoyne Matina erupting in the Andes that crashed global temperatures. And so all the trees literally had a ring of broken cells because it froze so fast during the growing season. So there's all these other characteristic tells you can find, but that pattern matching is like the most basic and the most beautiful. And so yeah, it's pretty fun.
Building off of that, have you found any stumps that were older than other things you could compare to, like ring data or other trees?
So yes, in our lab right now we have tree ring samples from the Palisades that surrounded Aztalan. Are you familiar with Aztalan? It's an archaeological site toward Milwaukee. It's a mound building site, one of these kind of furthest outposts. It was an early archaeology dig, really exciting, and there was an oak palisade. And so we have oak tree ring samples now that are probably between 900 and 1200-ish, that era. And so what we haven't gotten around to doing yet, but we're really excited, is to see if there's a match between the growth patterns in those oaks and the eastern red cedar rings. You're crossing species, it's a little different, we'll find out. It's one of the many things like, oh, that'd be really cool. So, but right now we don't have any oaks that get that far back. The canoes that they're digging out, those are often made of oak. And so there again, so there's like, we're kind of on the verge of this really cool connection to these really old timbers. But we do have several samples that we pulled out of the dirt at the base of Gibraltar Rock and cut, and they don't date, even though they have like 400 rings, which means that they could be even older. That'd be pretty cool.
Because the tree does not grow like uniformly, but so if you want to estimate the history of the tree, like do you need to make replicas for the course? Like usually how many replicas you need to have?
Great question. It is about scale, right? And so, was this year a good year or a bad year, right? And so what we will do on a single sample is we will have radii there, radii here, and we measure all those and we average for that tree. But then importantly, because you want that big signal, not only do you do multiple radii on a tree, but if here's a site, we'll take that tree and that tree and this tree and this tree, and then take an average across there. But that's not enough, because if you want to get that regional picture, then you need to get this site, and this site, and this site, and this site. And so as you start to accumulate more and more data, and you start kind of winnowing out what is the common signal, it is, it's a neat process to see basically the law of averages, where all of a sudden what they share is the climate. Because if you were looking at this tree and it had a narrow ring, could be a rock fall, could be a buckroad, could be a fire. But if this tree and this tree and this tree all have narrow rings, you're reducing the potential mechanisms. And if these trees and that one and that one and that one have a narrow ring, like you're reducing the variables that could explain that. Maybe one more, it's actually,
Yeah, let's just have one more question and then we'll.
yeah.
Yeah, awesome. Evan, thanks for your talk. You mentioned when you started on the Driftless Oaks project that you got a lot of community buy-in. Have you seen that sort of shift at all with the Driftless Cedars project, or is it still sort of the same strong community buy-in?
Good question. It has been incredibly less because cedars are not nearly as charismatic and well-known as oaks. But Leopold, to draw on him also, he will say, I don't remember if this is in land ethic or whatever, but he'll say like anybody can go to the national parks and see beauty. You can't not. It takes a lot of understanding to stand on a rolling prairie and see the same beauty. And so I feel like one of the public relations efforts that we want out of this is to help people also see the beauty of the cedars. Because once they get it, it's like, oh, and we're seeing that with some of the conservation groups in Iowa and stuff like that, where all of a sudden they're starting to think about protecting the cedars and the oaks, which is pretty cool. So, yeah.
Great. Well, let's thank Evan again for his talk.